Welcome to Name the Interval. In this video, we're going to be naming the intervals that we're looking at, so there's a trick to do this. We're going to be looking at the interval, and we're going to be looking at the bottom note. So in the first case, we're looking at C, and we're going to be thinking of this as a tonic note in a major scale. So because of this, when you build intervals on top of a tonic note in a major scale, you always have a major second, a major third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, and a major seventh. And because of this, all you have to do is think of that bottom note being the key that you're working in. So then you think of the notes in that major scale. So let's start doing this, and it's going to explain itself. And also stick around till the end because we're going to have some in the alto clef and also in the tenor clef just to practice reading those. Okay, so we're looking at the first one. This might be obvious to you, but this is going to get a little bit more difficult as we're going, so we're just going to slowly build up. So the bottom note is C. So we're going to think of C major. And of course that has no sharps and no flats. And above we see an F. And it's just a F natural. So this checks off as a perfect fourth because it's a fourth above and it's in the key. In the key of the bottom note. Okay, so the next one we see a D and a B, which creates a sixth. Of course you can just count the lines. I have two good tricks for this. One is reading. Just think of looking at a fifth and then go up one note. And then two, you can also do this while reading, but it's the concept of thinking a third below. So if I'm looking at a D, and if I imagined what would be below this D, well, a third below that would be a B. And if you think B, D, if you know your thirds, your circle of thirds, or if you know your chords, a B chord would be B, D, F. So just thinking in thirds here, because every line and every space is going up a third. So then you translate that above it. Okay, so one more time, I see the note D. I'm thinking a third below that is B, so it's B, D, but instead I'm putting that B above it. So now I have D, B. That's how I know it's a sixth. Okay, so we're going to do the first trick, and then I have a second trick just for this, just to throw in some stuff in this video. Okay, so our bottom note, we see D. So we're thinking of the key D major. If you're unsure about your keys and the circle of fifths, the circle of fifths will explain your keys and help you understand them, so I'll have a link to a video about that below. So let's say we're thinking going up clockwise on our circle of fifths. So from C, we have G and then D. So D is our second scale that has sharps. Because of this, it has two sharps. Those sharps are F and C sharp. Again, the video will explain all this. Okay, so we know we want an F and a C sharp. So simply we could look if we see any sharps. We don't see any sharps. We see a B natural. So we know that if this is a sixth, it is a major sixth. Now I told you I was going to have a different method for this too. So this is a really good one. And there's two parts to this concept. First is inverting. Since we have a DB, and I was explaining that's an inverted third, it's good to know that anytime you want to invert an interval, you can take the number 9 and subtract that from your interval you have to get your inverted version of that interval. Okay, so we have a sixth. If we do 9 minus 6, we have a third. So it's saying that you can have the same notes rearranged, inverted, using this 9 trick. So then if I had that third BD, and all that I do is 9 minus 3, now I have a 6, so I have DB. You just flip the notes, but subtracting from the number 9 tells you the interval you're working with. And then it's also good to know that when you invert an interval, you're also going to be changing if it's a major to a minor, and if it's a minor to a major. Okay, so if we're just thinking B, D, we could think simply of the fact that B doesn't have a sharp. So if we're going from B to D, then we're going to have one less semitone. Then if we did something like G to B, because G goes G, A, B, so there's not a missing sharp in there. So we have B, D, we're starting on B, we have that missing sharp, so we know it's a minor third. So we know if we invert this, we have a major sixth. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. That's just a really good trick to know. But before I move on, I'm just going to mention that when you invert a perfect interval, it remains perfect. When you invert an augmented interval, it becomes diminished. And when you invert a diminished interval, it becomes augmented. Moving on to interval number 3, we're looking at an E flat and a B flat. So we're thinking about the key of E flat major So now we think of the circle of fifths going counterclockwise. So we think from C, F, B flat, and then E flat. So that's the third scale going counterclockwise on the circle of fifths. Because of this, it has 3 flats. Those flats are B flat, E flat, and A flat. And look at this, we're looking at a B flat, so we know that is in the key we're working with. We're also looking at a fifth, so we know that we're looking at a perfect fifth. Of course, when first doing things like this, to really comprehend it, if it boggles your mind and you want to prove it to yourself, it's good to count up the semitones manually and then prove to yourself that, okay, this method works. And it's funny that when you really think about these things a lot and sometimes maybe even confuse yourself, it's not a bad thing, because then later on, maybe the next morning, maybe that night, you can sit there and you can really think about these things when you walk away from it at one point, and you can connect some ideas. Moving on to the next interval, we have an F and an F. So now we're thinking F major, we're thinking the first scale counterclockwise in the circle of fifths, so we have that 1 flat, which is B flat. And of course, we're looking at an octave here of F and F, so we know it's a perfect octave. I changed the next one because it's good to realize that when you're looking at a fifth interval, and let's say it's in the key that you're working in, then we might automatically assume, okay, it's a perfect fifth. Which I wouldn't say is a bad assumption, but it's good to think a little further than that. Because every note in your major scale is going to create a perfect fifth besides your 7th degree. So we're going to do the method in a second. But you can just realize that if you're in your key, your 7th degree of that key is always going to be that diminished fifth. So if we think of B in the key of C major, that's the 7th degree. Just think one note back from C is B. So automatically when we see this fifth built from the 7th degree in the scale that we're in, we're just pretending we're in C major for this one. You automatically know it's that diminished fifth. This just comes in handy in other scenarios. Okay, so now let's do the method. We see the note B, we're going to think the scale of B major. So in the circle of fifths going clockwise, we have G, D, A, E, B. That's the 5th scale going clockwise, so we have 5 sharps, F, C, G, D, A. And as you see, we have an F above that. We should have an F sharp. And because we don't have an F sharp, we know that this is a diminished fifth. Because when you lower a perfect interval by 1 semitone, it becomes diminished. If you raised it by a semitone, it would have become augmented. And now this is different from major or minor, because if you have a minor interval, then you can lower a semitone, it becomes diminished. But if you have that minor interval and you raise it by a semitone, it becomes major. And then if you have a major interval and you lower it by a semitone, it becomes minor. But if you have a major interval and you raise it by a semitone, it becomes augmented. So that's where major and perfect intervals differ. Okay, so now we're going down and reading the bass clef. So if you don't know how to read the bass clef, a good way to start reading the bass clef is to think of the same notes as the treble clef. So think of looking at the treble clef, but every time you see a note, it's actually a third above that in the bass clef. Okay, so let's start from the bottom line of the bass clef. In treble clef, we'd be looking at an E. So if we think a third above that, in other words, the next line, that would be a G. So the first line of our bass clef is a G. Now if we go to the first space of our bass clef, if we think treble clef, that would be an F. So we think a third above that or the next space above that. So that would be an A. So the first space in bass clef is an A. It's good to be proficient in reading the treble clef first before you start reading the bass clef a bunch. Because if you try reading both at the same time, you're probably going to end up mixing them up and confusing yourself a bit. So really get the treble clef down, know it, and then move on to the bass clef. Of course, it doesn't hurt to read some bass clef here and there if you're not proficient in treble clef yet, but I'm talking about writing music and reading music on a regular basis. Okay, so I'm going to go through the treble to bass clef trick on the first example, and then from there I'm just going to read it how I would normally read it. Okay, so the first interval on the bass clef. So this is for the beginners here. So if we're thinking about the treble clef, we'd see that the bottom note of this interval is the note C. So if we simply think a third above that, it's E. So now we know our bottom note is the note E. If you're wondering, nothing sharps or flats or anything like that changes from treble to bass clef. It's literally just the notes are shifted. That's it. So now we see the top note in treble clef would be an F. So we just think the next line above that or a third above that, we'd have an A. And since there's a sharp, then it would be A sharp. Okay, so now we know that we're looking at an interval of E and A sharp. So by looking at it, we can see it's a fourth because it's the next step above a third. And you can also think about that in your head, especially if you know the circle of thirds. So all you do is go E, G, and then up a note, A. So that's your fourth. Okay, so our bottom note is E. We're thinking of the scale of E major. So that's going to have 4 sharps, and we're going to have F, C, G, D. So as you can see, we have a sharpened note, but it's not one of those notes in the scale. So because of this interval is actually bigger by a semitone than what you'd find in the scale, since we just find a perfect fourth, we know this is now an augmented fourth. Again, it might help if you count the semitones. Okay, the next one, we're looking at an F flat and G. Of course, this might be obvious because if you think of F to G, that's a major second, so F flat to G, you can probably already guess what that is. But the point of this is to practice this method, so later on, when you're doing something that's a lot more complex, you can understand this method and it can be a no-brainer. You can look at any 2 intervals, you could just say, okay, I know what that is. Okay, so this might seem ridiculous, but remember, F flat, we're not an F major, we're an F flat major. Okay, now, if you think about the key of F flat, that's not an actual key on the circle of fifths or something that someone would want to use. So what happens when you have a note that's not an actual key? And in this case, I would say it's good to know 2 things. And that's where your flats and your sharps are, 1, and then 2, your inversions, in case you need to make this easier for yourself. So in this case, we only have a second interval, so it's easy. We wouldn't need to do the inversions. I'll explain why you would do that. But you can simply think F flat to G. And however you want to look at it, you can look at F sharp to G still, even though you're thinking about flats. You just need to be aware that there's a note in between F and G. Okay, so if you know there's that note in between F and G, now you know you have a major second just thinking about that. So if you have F flat where you're starting from is lowered by 1, now you have an augmented second. So there's that. I think that's less complicated than thinking about the key you're using, which I'll explain in a second. But then let's say we had a bigger interval like a 7th or something. So if these notes were flipped and instead you had a G on the bottom then an F above that, you'd now have a 7th. And now that might seem like a big deal to break down if you're just thinking about the semitones. But now if you think about it inverted, so it'd be what we're looking at right now. So if you inverted that G to F flat, you'd be looking at this F flat to G. And if you worked out the pretty simple method that I did and you said, okay, that's an augmented second, then you could think of the inversion trick. You could either know your inversions, which there's not that many, or you could start off by thinking about the 9 minus trick. So 9 minus 2, we have a 7th, and an augmented turns into a diminished. So if we had the same notes, but inverted to where we had that G on the bottom, and with the F sharp above it, we'd automatically know that we're working with a diminished 7th. Okay, so if we think about the same F flat to G, we think about the keys that we're using. You could see where in this case it'd be confusing since F flat's not an actual key. We then have to think about the enharmonic key of E major, which again would have F, C, G, and D sharp. And as we see, we have a G natural, so we don't have a G sharp. Because of that, it's not in the key, but we need to think where we're starting from. We're not starting from an F flat. We're thinking about the key of E major now, so we're starting from an E. So an E to a G would be a third. So remember, always in the key, it's a major, so that would be a minor since G is not in the key. But since we're not looking at an E, we're looking at an F flat, we need to think about an interval of a second that has the same amount of intervals as a minor third. So now we have a augmented second. So you can see where this method works good and sometimes it may be a little overcomplicated, and in that case you could just think about the notes that you're using, the fact that in between the notes B and C there's not a note, and in between the notes E and F, there's not a note there. So you can use that to your advantage, and when you get to bigger intervals, you can just think about their inverted version, and then just realize when you invert it how it changes the qualities. Okay, so you have two kind of methods working here, whether you're working with a note that's in a key or if you're not. Okay, so our next interval, we see a C and an E. Okay, so simply think the fact that if you had a C and an E right above that, you'd have a third. So now we have a compound third. You could also call this a tenth. Okay, so even though this looks like a big interval, it's actually only doing the interval of a third. Since even though it's spread by an octave apart, it's still the same two notes playing together. So it's just a compound third, or what some people might call a broken third. So the notes are broken, they're not right next to each other. So obviously, working in the key of C major, no sharps, no flats, we see an E natural, so pretty obviously we know this is a major third. So now think, if we were to invert this major third, what would that be? It would be a minor sixth. Okay, and that would just be if C was above this E. Okay, next we see an E natural and a D sharp. It's another one that I have a trick for. But first we're in the key of E. We've been doing this E major, F, C, G, and D. So we know that we should have a D sharp. We're looking at a D sharp, we know it's major. And if we look at it, we can tell it's a seventh. If you look at where it's starting from and you just count up from there, but also if you want to think about how it's a seventh in your head, you could think about one note below from where you're starting on. So we think in E, we know one note below an E is a D. Therefore, if you see a D note above this, you know that it's a seventh. And now also with that trick, you need to think of the semitones. So if it's one semitone back from where you're starting, in this case, we're starting on an E, and then we're going back to a D sharp. So that's only a one semitone difference. When your seventh has a one semitone difference from the note you're starting on, it's a major seventh. But if it's two semitones, you know that it's a minor seventh. So if this was an E to a D natural, you'd know that would actually be a minor seventh. And if it's three semitones, you know it's a diminished. So if this was an E and a D flat, you'd know that would actually be a diminished seventh. Okay, last one, and remember we have some alto and tenor clef. I'm going to try to go through those pretty quickly because there's a simple trick for reading it actually, and we've already been going through the whole method. Okay, so in the bass clef, if we see one line below, we can realize that it's the same note, not at the same pitch, as the first line of the treble clef. So the first line of the treble clef would be an E, just imagine that. So for one note below that, we'd have a D. And then of course, one line above a bass clef is middle C. So we're one note below that. So one note below C is a B. So now we know we're looking at a D and a B flat. Okay, well, that kind of seems like a lot of notes to count. So let's shorten this a little bit and make this easier. First, if you know your circle of thirds or your chords, this should be pretty simple. You see the notes D and B and you should automatically think, okay, that's a part of a third. So let's think about it as a third. We'd have the notes B and D, but in fact it's D and B. So now we automatically know it's a sixth. We can tell by looking at it that it's more than an octave above the note that we're working with. Because of this, now we know it's a sixth, and now we know it's a compound sixth. Okay, so actually not as complicated as it might look in the beginning. So as you can see, it's really good to understand your inversions. I have videos on inverting triads and inverting seventh chords, and I also have a video all about intervals that explains inversions really in depth. It gives you the 9 trick. It gives you a trick for inverting semitones so when you're working chromatically. It's an hour-long video about intervals. So I'll leave that in the description too. But to get to this, we're looking at D and B flat. So we're looking at the key of D major. That is the second key going clockwise on the circle of fifths. So we know we should have the notes F sharp and C sharp. Well, of course that doesn't work because the note we have is B and it's a B flat. But that can help us realize that in the key, since we have an F sharp and a C sharp, that normally in the key B would just be natural. So now if we're looking at a sixth and it's one semitone, then it would be in the key. Since it would always be a major sixth built off that note from the key, we now know it's a minor sixth. So that was a lot of work to figure that out. So again, I was saying this trick works, but also a good trick is just to realize where your sharps and your flats are. So again, we could backtrack. We could think we have the notes D and B. So we could put those together at the smallest interval, which would be B and D, which would be a third. Next, we know that if we're starting from B and ending on D as a third, we're missing a sharp because from the notes B to C, there is no note in the middle of that. Okay, so if we had a B, D, we'd be working with a minor third, but we have a B flat to D. So now we have a major third. And if you invert a major third, because we have those notes, now you'd have a minor sixth, an octave above where it would normally be. You have a compound minor sixth. So personally, that's what I would do. But let's say you're stressed and you're thinking really hard and you want to double check what you're doing. Well, now you can also double check by thinking, okay, I'm in the key of D major, and you can do the trick that we've been talking about.